The stench of fear and cheap ale soured the air in the city square. Varan Thalos kept his head down, the rough-spun cowl of his cloak pulled low to hide the sharp angles of a face that did not belong among these soft-fleshed humans. For a century, he had walked their squalid streets, breathing their dust-choked air, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had forgotten him. Or more accurately, had tried to erase him. He was a creature of shadow in a kingdom that worshipped the sun, a living blasphemy whose very existence was a death sentence. Today, death was the main attraction. In the center of the square, a crude wooden gallows stood stark against the brilliant azure sky. High above, a glimmer of gold caught the light. A dragon lord of the Sunfire clan, patrolling the heavens, a casual display of power that kept the human cattle in line. Varan's jaw tightened. He could feel the dragon's heat even from this distance, a clean, arrogant fire that made the cursed flame in his own blood writhe with ancient hatred. He forced it down, smothering the embers of his true nature beneath layers of practiced calm. Control was survival, forgetting was peace. A roar went up from the crowd as the prisoner was dragged forward. A woman. Her hair was the color of midnight, spilled over with starlight, tangled and matted with grime. Her tunic was torn, her hands bound tightly behind her back, but she did not weep or beg. Her chin was lifted in a gesture of such defiant pride that it cut through the jeering mob like a shard of glass. This was Seren Kaith, the moonfire-marked thief. Varan had heard the whispers in the taverns and marketplaces. A thief who could walk through locked doors, a phantom who stole from the city's corrupt merchant lords. But it wasn't her crimes that had condemned her. It was the mark. On her left temple, just visible beneath a stray lock of dark hair, was a faint silvery crescent. It seemed to drink the sunlight and turn it into a soft lunar glow. Moonfire, a lesser, almost forgotten magic, considered a peasant superstition. Yet here she was, sentenced to hang for it. The dragon lords tolerated no magic but their own celestial flames. The guards shoved her onto the platform. The hangman, a brute with a stained leather apron, threw the noose over her head. Seren's eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept across the jeering faces below. They held no fear, only a profound, bottomless contempt. And then, for a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, her gaze locked with Varan's. He froze. It was impossible. He was cloaked, hooded, one shadow among 1,000. Yet she saw him. Not the man he pretended to be, but the hollowed-out thing he had become. In that instant, something deep within his chest, a chamber of his heart he thought had turned to stone and ash, cracked open. A flicker. A resonance. It felt like a forgotten note of music heard through a thick stone wall. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. No, do not look, do not feel, you are a memory. A ghost. He had survived this long by being nothing, by wanting nothing, by severing every tie to the world that had cast him out. His wings, magically sealed and bound to the bones of his back, sent a searing throb of agony through him, a phantom pain that was his constant companion. They were a reminder of what he had lost. The sky, the wind, the fire of his birthright. All of it burned away by the curse of shadow fire that flowed through his veins. The hangman tightened the rope. Seren gasped, her defiant posture finally breaking. Her silvery mark pulsed, a soft, desperate light. The crowd surged forward, hungry for the spectacle. The Sunfire dragon overhead dipped a wing in lazy acknowledgement of the justice being served. And Varan's control shattered. It wasn't a decision, it was an instinct, ancient and absolute, rising from the very core of his being. The shadow fire, the corrupting flame he had spent his entire existence suppressing, did not roar. It uncoiled, sleek and silent as a viper. The world seemed to slow, the jeers of the crowd deepening into a dull, distant drone. He saw the fraying edge of the hangman's rope, the sweat on the guard's upper lip, the tear that finally escaped Seren's eye and traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. He moved. To the humans, it would have looked like a flicker of motion, a stumble in the crowd, a gust of wind kicking up dust. But for Varan, it was a dance. He flowed between bodies, a river of darkness in a sea of sun-drenched flesh. His hand, shrouded in shadow, slipped a stolen dirk from his belt. The blade was a whisper of steel as it flew. Not at the hangman, but at the heavy sandbag, used as a counterweight for the gallows trap. The dirk sliced through the thick rope holding the sandbag. With a groan of splintering wood, the counterweight crashed to the platform. The trapdoor, its mechanism ruined, jolted but did not fall. Chaos erupted. People screamed, shoving back from the collapsing gallows. The guards, startled from their stupor, drew their swords, shouting confused orders. The hangman stumbled back, tripping over the very rope meant to end Seren's life. In that single perfect moment of mayhem, Varen was on the platform. He moved with a predator's grace that was utterly inhuman. He grabbed Seren's arm, his fingers closing around her bicep. And the world caught fire. The moment their skin touched, a jolt, white-hot and blinding, shot through him. It was not the agonizing burn of his own curse, but something else entirely. Her moonfire mark blazed, not silver, but a brilliant, searing white. It flooded his senses, a torrent of pure, cool light that slammed into the coiled darkness within him. His shadow fire met it, but it did not devour. It did not corrupt or destroy. For the first time in his cursed life, the shadow fire did not feel like a poison. It sang. It resonated with her light. A deep harmonic thrum that vibrated from his bones to the very tips of his sealed wings. The chronic, grinding pain in his back vanished, replaced by an explosive, breathtaking ache of pure potential. He felt the phantom shape of them, vast and powerful, straining against their bonds. Seren cried out, her eyes wide with shock. She was looking at his hand on her arm, where a wisp of true shadow, blacker than a starless night, curled from his skin, dancing with the incandescent light pouring from her mark. It was not a battle. It was a terrifying, beautiful union, purity and corruption intertwined. The spell was broken by the clang of steel. A guard, braver than the rest, lunged at them. Varen reacted without thought. He spun, pulling Seren behind him. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply extended his hand, and a tendril of absolute darkness lashed out. Not burning, but unmaking. The guard's sword dissolved into black dust a hair's breadth from his face. The man stared at his empty hilt, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "Sorcery!" someone shrieked. The word was a death knell. Varen didn't wait for the panic to turn into a mob. He wrapped an arm around Seren's waist, half lifting her, and leaped from the platform. They landed hard in the churning crowd. He pushed forward, a wraith carving a path through the chaos. Her body was light in his arms, her breath hot against his neck. The connection between them was a living current, a roaring river of power that made him feel more alive than he had in 100 years. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. They plunged into the labyrinth of alleys that webbed the city's underbelly. The shouts of the guards and the distant, furious roar of the Sunfire Dragon faded behind them, replaced by the dripping of sewage and the scuttling of rats. He didn't stop running until they were deep in the forgotten parts of the city, a slum of leaning tenements and derelict warehouses that the guard never patrolled. He finally shoved Seren into the relative darkness of a crumbling archway, his body shielding the entrance. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from exertion, but from the raw, untamed power her touch had unleashed. The shadow fire was still thrumming beneath his skin, awake and hungry, a beast roused from a long slumber. Seren slid down the damp stone wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stared at him, her storm-gray eyes wide with a terror that was slowly being eclipsed by a dawning, impossible understanding. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed, not at his face, but at his back. Your shadow," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It has wings." Varen looked down. She was right. The dim light filtering into the alley cast his silhouette against the opposing wall. And there, stretching from his shoulders, was the undeniable shape of vast, draconic wings, wrought from pure, unholy darkness. They weren't real. They were an echo, an after-image of the power she had ignited. He quickly suppressed the fire, forcing it back into its cage of flesh and bone. The phantom wings of shadow dissolved. He turned to face her, the cowl falling back to reveal his face for the first time. The sharp, aristocratic lines of his features, the intensity in his dark eyes, marked him as something other than human. She stared at him, at the man who had appeared from nowhere, who had commanded the darkness itself to save her. The terror in her eyes was finally giving way to a dangerous, piercing curiosity. She pushed herself to her feet, her gaze unwavering. They were going to hang me for a flicker of moonlight on my skin, she said, her voice shaking but steady. But you are something else, something they hunt to extinction. She took a hesitant step closer, her eyes fixed on his. What are you? The horns of the city guard blared in the distance, a mournful hunting cry that promised a city-wide search. High above, the roar of the Dragon Lord echoed, a sound of righteous fury that promised a far more terrible retribution. Varen had just traded a century of quiet damnation for a new, infinitely more dangerous reality. He had saved her, and in doing so, had condemned them both. His secret was out, not in a shout, but in a whisper of shadow and a touch of light. And it was a secret that would burn the world to the ground. What are you? Her question hung in the damp air, sharp and clear as a shard of ice. Varen's first instinct, honed by a century of solitude and fear, was to lie, to craft a story, to push her away, to sever the fragile, terrifying thread that had just been woven between them. But the resonating hum of her light still echoed in his blood, a warmth he hadn't realized he was starving for. Lying felt like a betrayal of that impossible sensation. He pulled his cowl back up, plunging his face into shadow. I am your only chance of surviving the next hour, he bit out, his voice a low rasp. Now be slent. The roar of the Sunfire Dragon split the sky again, closer this time. It was a sound of pure incandescent rage. A shower of dust and mortar rained down from the ancient brickwork above them as the very foundations of the city seemed to tremble. The hunt was on, and they were the prey. We have to move, he said, grabbing her arm again. The jolt was still there, a shockwave of light and shadow that made the muscles in his back clench in a spasm of agonizing pleasure. He forced himself to ignore it, pulling her deeper into the labyrinth. Stay close, make no sound. Seren didn't resist, but her silence was a heavy, questioning thing. He led them through a maze of alleys so narrow they had to turn sideways, the bricks scraping their shoulders. The city's filth was their camouflage. They waded through gutters flowing with refuse, their steps silenced by the muck. He moved with a certainty born of long, lonely years spent mapping the forgotten corners of this gilded cage. Every loose stone, every dripping pipe, every shadow was a landmark in the geography of his exile. Eventually, he stopped before a heavy iron grate set into the cobblestones. The stench of stagnant water and decay billowed up from below. In here, Seren balked, her nose wrinkling in disgust. The sewers? The Sunfire Lords patrol the sky and their lackeys patrol the streets, Varen said, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. He wedged his fingers under the grate, his muscles straining. They do not patrol the filth. They believe themselves above it. With a groan of rusted metal, he lifted the grate. The darkness below was absolute. He dropped into the channel, landing with a soft splash in the ankle-deep water. He looked up at her, a silhouette against the sliver of dying light. Are you coming, or do you wish to explain my shadow-winged silhouette to the Dragon Lord? Her hesitation lasted only a moment. She sat on the edge and slid down, and he caught her, his hands closing around her waist. For a dizzying second, their bodies were pressed together in the close darkness. Her heart hammered against his chest, a frantic, vital rhythm. He could feel the soft warmth of her breath on his cheek. The light from her moonfire mark pulsed faintly, a tiny star in the oppressive gloom, and it was all he could do not to pull her closer, to drink in the strange, soothing balm of her presence. He released her abruptly, turning away to hide the tremor in his hands. This way. They moved in near total blackness, guided only by the faint phosphorescent moss that grew on the damp tunnel walls and the sound of Varen's sure-footed steps. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the ghosts of the city above. For a long time, the only sounds were their splashing footsteps and ragged breaths. The immediate danger had passed, replaced by a tense, suffocating intimacy. You never answered my question, Seren finally said, her voice echoing strangely off the curved walls. I have no answers for you, Varen replied, not stopping. The pain was returning to his back, a dull, familiar ache that settled deep into his bones. The relief her touch had brought was fading, leaving behind a craving that was a new kind of torture. You controlled the shadows, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. They bent to your will. The guard's sword turned to dust. I've spent my life stealing baubles from the rich, and they call me a monster for the mark on my face. But you are something from the old tales, the forbidden ones." He stopped so suddenly she almost ran into him. He turned, and even in the near darkness, she could feel the weight of his stare. "The old tales are cautionary for a reason, thief. Some things are better left buried." "Not when they save your life," she shot back, taking a step closer. The tiny silver crescent at her temple glowed a little brighter, illuminating the defiant set of her jaw. "I have a right to know who I'm running with, who I am now bound to, by whatever magic that was." He flinched at the word bound. It was too close to the truth. That spark in the square had felt like a shackle snapping into place, linking them, for better or worse. "You are bound to nothing. Once you are safe, we part ways. I will go back to my shadows, and you can go back to your baubles." "And what if I don't want to?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. "Whatever happened back there, when you touched me, I felt it, the light inside me. It's never done that before. It answered you, and your darkness. It didn't feel evil, it felt lonely." His breath caught in his throat. Lonely, a simple word that struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had been powerful, hunted, cursed, forgotten. But no one, in all his long years, had ever seen his darkness and named it lonely. He felt his defenses crack, the carefully constructed walls of his isolation crumbling under the assault of her perception. He turned and began walking again, faster this time. "You see what you want to see." They emerged an hour later, climbing a rusted ladder into the cellar of a derelict tannery. The acrid smell of curing chemicals was a welcome replacement for the sewer's stench. The district was a graveyard of failed businesses and forgotten warehouses, pressed against the city's outer wall. Here, the rule of the Sunfire Lords felt thin and frayed. Varen led her to a tall, narrow building squeezed between two crumbling tenements. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded, its heavy oak door grayed with age and neglect. He knocked a complex rhythm upon the wood, a series of quick taps and pauses that sounded like a secret code. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a small grate in the door slid open, and a pair of weary, suspicious eyes peered out. "Go away," a reedy voice grumbled. "The shop is closed, has been for 50 years. "The dust of ages settles on forgotten words," Ulyan, Varen said, his voice low. "But the ink of truth never fades." The eyes in the grate widened. There was a sound of multiple bolts being drawn, and the heavy door creaked open. The man who stood there was ancient, a stooped figure in a dusty scholar's robe, with a fringe of white hair clinging to a liver-spotted scalp. He held a flickering candle, which cast dancing shadows across shelves overflowing with scrolls and leather-bound tomes. The air smelled of parchment, beeswax, and time itself. "Thalos," the old scholar whispered, his voice trembling. "By the fallen moons, I thought you were a ghost story, a cautionary tale I read in a burnt manuscript." His gaze flickered to Seren, and his suspicion returned. "What trouble have you brought to my door?" "The kind that rains fire from the sky," Varen said, pushing Seren gently inside and closing the door behind them. "We need sanctuary, just until morning." Olian's eyes scanned Seren, lingering on her moonfire mark. He shook his head, muttering. "Light and shadow, a dangerous combination. Always has been." He shuffled deeper into his library, the candlelight bobbing before him. "Don't touch anything, and don't bleed on the books. Some of them are older than your entire cursed bloodline." The library was a hoarder's paradise of forbidden knowledge. Books were stacked to the ceiling, scrolls spilled from overflowing crates, and strange astrological charts were pinned to every available surface. It was a haven of shadows and secrets, Varen's natural habitat. But with Seren here, it felt different. The space was charged, the silence between them humming with unspoken questions. She stood in the center of the room, her gaze fixed on him, refusing to let him escape. The hunt was outside, but the true confrontation was here, in this dusty room, between the two of them. "No more running," she said, her voice soft but firm. "No more hiding in sewers or behind cryptic words. I deserve the truth. Show me." Varen's shoulders slumped in weary defeat. He was tired of running, not just from the guards, but from the question in her eyes, from the hope she had unknowingly kindled. He turned his back to her, a gesture of profound surrender. With slow, deliberate movements, he unlaced the ties of his rough tunic and pulled it over his head. The candlelight flickered over the scarred landscape of his back. It was a ruin of flesh. 2 great, gnarled ridges of scar tissue ran from his shoulder blades to his waist, puckered and twisted. Along these ridges, faint geometric patterns were branded into his skin, the remains of the magical seals that kept his wings bound, that kept his dragon form caged within his human shell. The curse was not just in his blood, it was carved into his very being. "The Sunfire clan calls my kind abominations," he said, his voice raw with a pain that went far beyond the physical. "Shadow wielders, devourers, they hunted us, drove us from the skies, and erased our history. I am the last. They sealed my wings, cursed my fire to burn me from the inside out, and cast me down to live among humans as a permanent reminder of their victory." He waited for the gasp of horror, the recoil of disgust. It was the reaction he had always expected, the reason he had never shown this to another living soul. But it didn't come. Instead, he heard her soft footsteps on the dusty floorboards. He felt her presence behind him, a hesitant warmth. And then her fingers, light as a moth's wing, touched the highest point of the scar on his right shoulder blade. He hissed, his whole body going rigid, expecting the familiar lance of agony. But the pain didn't come. A cool silver light bloomed from her hand, seeping through her skin and into his. It was the light of her moonfire, but gentle this time, a soothing balm that sank deep into the ancient wounds. The chronic grinding ache that had been his constant companion for a century began to dissolve, replaced by a feeling of such profound relief that his knees almost buckled. The shadow fire within him stirred, not with hunger, but with a deep, purring contentment, like a beast being stroked for the first time. Seren made a soft sound of wonder. "It's like pouring cool water on a burn." Her hand moved, tracing the path of the scar, her light following, chasing away the shadows of his pain. It was more than he could bear. A choked sound escaped his throat, and he turned, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her snatch her hand back. He saw not fear in her gaze, but a deep, startling empathy. It was Olian who broke the spell. The old scholar, who had been watching from the shadows, took a shuffling step forward, his eyes wide, his candle trembling in his hand. He wasn't looking at Varen's scars. He was staring, transfixed, at the fading silver light on Seren's fingertips. "The House of Caith," he breathed, his voice filled with a disbelieving awe. The history said the line was extinguished, wiped out by the Sunfire purge. He looked at her moonfire mark, his eyes alight with sudden, terrifying understanding. It was never just a thief's mark. It's a focus, a key. Varen stared at the old man confused. "What are you talking about, Olian?" Olian ignored him, his gaze locked on Serena. "The oldest legends don't speak of Shadowfire as a curse," he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of his revelation. "They call it the primal flame, the fire of creation itself, raw and untamed. They say it was so powerful it required a balance, a counterpart, a fire born not of the sun, but of the moon's reflection." He pointed a shaking finger at Serena. The legends called its bearer the lunar scion, the only soul with the light not to destroy the shadow, but to bind with it, to make it whole. The old scholar's words fell into the silence of the library like stones into a deep well. The lunar scion, the only soul with the light, to make it whole. Seren stared at Olian, her face a pale mask of disbelief. "Lunar scion? I'm a thief. My parents were weavers from the South Quarter. I stole to eat, not to fulfill some dusty prophecy." Her voice was sharp, a shield against the sudden, terrifying weight of the scholar's claim. "Prophecy is not a choice, child," Olian said, his reedy voice gaining a strange authority. He shuffled toward a towering stack of scrolls, pulling a heavy, iron-bound codex from the bottom of the pile. Dust plumed in the candlelight. "It is a debt passed through the blood. The Sunfire Lords have spent centuries burning books and twisting history to make the world forget. They want Varen's fire to be seen as a curse, a corruption, but what if it is simply incomplete?" Varen felt a cold dread mix with a fragile, dangerous flicker of hope. He had spent his life believing himself to be a mistake, a blight on the world. The idea that his shadow fire was not a curse, but a half-truth was so radical, so profoundly earth-shattering, that he couldn't bring himself to believe it. It felt like a crueler torture than the sealing of his wings. "Enough, Olian," Varen growled, pulling his tunic back on, the rough fabric a familiar penance against his scarred skin. "They are fairy tales, the rantings of dead madmen." "Are they?" Olian retorted, blowing a thick layer of dust from the codex. He laid the massive book on a lectern, its pages yellowed and brittle. He ran a gnarled finger down a passage of elegant, archaic script. "Listen. The shadow consumes, but the moon redeems. The primal flame, born of the void between stars, knows no master, save for the one whose soul carries the silvered heart of the fallen moon. Their touch is the catalyst, their light the anvil, and upon their union the darkness is not extinguished, but forged anew." He looked up, his old eyes burning with conviction. "It doesn't describe a curse, Thalos. It describes a bond, a soul flame." Seren took a hesitant step toward the lectern. She looked from the ancient text to Varen, her stormy eyes searching his. The memory of their touch was a phantom sensation on her skin. The jolt, the fusion of light and shadow, the way his pain had receded beneath her hand. It hadn't felt like she was fighting his darkness. It had felt like coming home. "Even if this is true," Varen said, his voice tight, "what does it matter? The Dragon Lord of Light is hunting us. The Iron Scale Order, the human hunters who serve them, will be turning this city inside out. This book changes nothing." "It changes everything," Olian insisted, slamming a frail hand on the lectern for emphasis. "The lords fear you not for what you are, but for what you could become. If you are bound to the lunar scion, you are the only one who can truly challenge their dominion. Your fire, tempered by her light, would not be the chaotic, self-consuming thing they have made it. It would be balanced, perfected." The thought was a dizzying vertigo. For a century, Varen's power had been an agony, a serpent eating its own tail inside him. The brief moments he'd touched Seren were the only times he had felt anything but that agony. It had been an absence of pain so profound it felt like a form of ecstasy. A sudden sharp rapping at the front door made all three of them freeze. It wasn't the rhythmic code Varen had used. It was the hard, impatient knock of authority. "Olian the scribe," a voice boomed from the street, rough and commanding. "Open in the name of Lord Kalin of the Sunfire clan. We have reason to believe you are harboring fugitives." Varen's blood ran cold. He had been so careful, 100 years of leaving no trace, and he had led them straight here. He drew a long, wicked-looking blade from the sheath hidden at the small of his back, its dark metal seeming to drink the candlelight. His body fell into a predator's crouch, his eyes fixed on the door. "They cannot know we are here," Seren whispered, her face pale. "They do not need to know," Olian hissed, his scholarly frailty vanishing, replaced by a wiry tension. "Kalin's hunters are thorough. They will tear this place apart on suspicion alone." He scurried toward the back of the library, his robes flapping around his ankles. "The prophecy is a map, Thalos, but you need to live long enough to read it. Follow me, quickly." The pounding on the door grew more violent. The thick oak shuddered in its frame. "Last chance, scribe!" Olian heaved against a massive bookshelf filled with geological texts. With a low groan of protest, the entire unit swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening in the stone wall behind it. The air that wafted out was ancient and cold, smelling of deep earth and stone. "A secret passage?" Seren breathed. "A house of secrets needs many exits," Olian said grimly. "It leads down to the old aqueduct system, built before the dragons came, before the city even had its name. Go, follow the main channel north. It will take you beyond the city walls. From there, you are on your own." Varen grabbed Seren's arm, pulling her toward the opening. "Olian, come with us." The old scholar shook his head, a sad, resolute smile on his face. "I am too old to run, and besides, someone needs to delay them." He pushed a heavy satchel into Seren's hands. It was filled with rolled scrolls. "The prophecies, the histories they tried to burn. You are the last custodians of this truth. Do not let it die with me." A splintering crash came from the front of the shop as the door finally gave way. Heavy, armored footsteps stomped inside, accompanied by the clatter of drawn steel. "Go," Olian urged, giving Varen a desperate shove. "The fate of more than just your own lives depends on it." Varen didn't hesitate. He pulled Seren into the oppressive darkness of the tunnel and turned to help Olian swing the heavy bookshelf shut. The last thing he saw before the passage was sealed was the old scholar standing tall amidst his life's work, a single candle in his hand, his face a calm mask of defiance, as the armored soldiers of the Iron Scale Order stormed into his library. The heavy thud of the bookshelf closing plunged them into absolute blackness. A moment later, they heard a muffled shout, followed by the roar of dragon fire, not Varen's shadow flame, but the clean, bright, destructive fire of the sun. A wave of heat washed through the stone. Olian had bought them their time. Varen stood frozen in the dark, the scholar's sacrifice a fresh wound in his soul. Another person dead because of him, another debt he could never repay. It was Seren's hand, finding his in the darkness, that broke him from his stupor. Her grip was firm, her skin cool. The spark ignited between them, a soft internal glow that pushed back the suffocating blackness. It was a comfort, a compass, a silent promise. "We can't let him have died for nothing," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the immense silence. "He believed in us." Her words cut through his guilt. She was right. Mourning was a luxury they couldn't afford. He squeezed her hand and started moving, pulling her along the rough-hewn stone passage. The air grew colder, the sound of dripping water echoing ahead. They descended into the earth, into the forgotten bones of the city, with the roar of the Sunfire Lord's rage echoing far above. The aqueduct was a marvel of ancient engineering, a vast circular tunnel wide enough for 2 dragons to fly abreast. A shallow, swift-moving channel of pure, cold water ran down its center. The darkness was no longer absolute. A faint, ethereal light emanated from strange, phosphorescent crystals embedded in the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. They walked for what felt like hours, the satchel of scrolls bumping against Seren's hip, a heavy reminder of their new burden. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic splash of their footsteps and the murmur of the water. "The House of Kaith," Varen said finally, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Olian mentioned your family name." Seren looked down, her expression shadowed. "I never knew them. I grew up in an orphanage. The matrons told me my parents died of the wasting plague. They said the mark on my temple was a symptom of the disease's touch on my mother's womb." "They lied," Varen said, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. "They were hiding you, protecting you." "From what? From who?" "From the Sunfire clan. If your bloodline holds the key to balancing mine, they would have seen you as the greatest possible threat to their power. They wouldn't just kill you, they would have dissected you, studied your magic, tried to twist it for their own purposes." A shudder ran through her. "All my life, I thought this mark was a curse, something that made me an outcast, a freak." She touched her temple, where the crescent glowed with a soft, steady light in the dim tunnel. "And now it might be the only thing that can save you." The implication hung between them. Save him, make him whole. The prophecy wasn't just about power, it was about union, about a bond that went deeper than flesh, deeper than magic, a bond of souls. He stopped, turning to face her. The crystal light cast her face in shades of silver and blue, making her eyes look like pools of liquid moonlight. He could feel the pull between them, a magnetic force that was growing stronger, more undeniable, with every beat of his heart. His own shadow fire stirred, not with aggression, but with a deep, primal yearning. It wanted to be near her light. It needed it. He reached out, his hand hesitating just inches from her face. "Seren!" Before he could finish, a low, guttural growl echoed from the tunnel ahead. It was not the sound of a dragon or a man. It was something else, something ancient and hungry that had been sleeping in the deep places of the world. They both froze, their hushed moment of connection shattered. From the darkness ahead, 2 points of malevolent green light ignited, like embers from a hellish fire. The growling intensified, a wet, rasping sound that promised torn flesh and broken bones. Varen pushed Seren behind him, drawing his dark blade. The creature that slouched into the crystal light was a thing of nightmare. It was reptilian, larger than a wolf, with mottled, scaly hide and long, powerful limbs that ended in hooked claws. A basilisk, a subterranean predator drawn to magical resonance. It had sensed them. It had sensed him. The basilisk lowered its head and hissed, a plume of acrid yellow vapor misting from its jaws. Its gaze, hypnotic and deadly, fixed on Varen. He met its stare, his own will a cold, hard shield against the creature's petrifying magic. But then the beast's gaze shifted, flicking past him to Serene. Her gasp was sharp and choked. "Don't look into its eyes!" Varen shouted, but it was too late. The basilisk's eyes were twin emeralds of pure malevolence. Serene's gasp was stolen from her lungs as that gaze locked onto her. A deep, paralyzing cold shot through her veins, starting in her feet and climbing with terrifying speed. It was not the chill of the tunnel, but a deadening, invasive cold that felt like liquid stone being poured into her soul. Her limbs grew heavy, her movements sluggish. She tried to look away, to break the contact, but her muscles refused to obey. Her skin took on a gray, stony pallor. No, Varen's roar was a sound of pure fury, a predator's snarl that was more dragon than man. He lunged, not at the beast, but at Serene, moving to block her line of sight. But he was a fraction of a second too late. The petrifying magic had already taken root. He saw the life draining from her eyes, the vibrant storm gray dulling to the flat, lifeless color of slate. The process was horrifyingly fast. Her fingers, which had been clutching the satchel of scrolls, were already stiffening, her knuckles turning to marbled gray stone. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. His mind raced through ancient lore, through every scrap of knowledge he'd ever gleaned about these creatures. The gaze was the weapon. Once locked, the victim was lost. There was no cure, but the lore had never accounted for her, for him, for the impossible connection that hummed between them. As the stone-cold dread climbed her legs, reaching her waist, the silver crescent on her temple pulsed, a frantic, desperate beacon of light fighting against the encroaching death. And Varen's shadow fire answered its call. It surged within him, a tidal wave of living darkness, driven not by rage, but by a desperate, possessive need to protect. Mine, a voice that was not his own, seemed to whisper from the core of his being, "She is not to be taken." He didn't think. He acted. He dropped his blade, the clatter of its fall lost in the thundering of his own heart. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing his thumbs over her eyes to shield them. His skin on hers was a shock of warmth against the creeping, magical frost. "Serene, fight it," he commanded, his voice raw. "Feel my fire. Let it in." It was the most dangerous gamble of his life. He was asking her to welcome the very curse he had spent a century trying to contain, to invite the serpent into her soul. He closed his eyes and focused, not on destroying the basilisk, but on saving her. He drew upon the shadow fire. But instead of unleashing it as a weapon, he channeled it. He pushed it from his own body, through his hands, and poured it directly into her. For Serene, the world had become a gray, silent prison. She could feel her own life force being extinguished, replaced by the inert, patient permanence of stone. Then came his touch, and with it, the darkness. It was not the petrifying cold of the basilisk, but a different kind of chill. It was a living void, a cold fire that felt like the space between stars. It poured into her, an invading army of shadow meeting the advancing front of stone. The two forces clashed within her veins. It was agony, a war being waged in the very marrow of her bones. The stone was unmaking her life. The shadow was unmaking the stone. She screamed, a choked, silent sound trapped in a throat that was rapidly hardening. She felt his essence, his lonely, ancient darkness, flooding every part of her. It was a terrifying violation, an intimate invasion that laid his soul bare to her. She felt his centuries of pain, his suffocating isolation, his burning shame, and beneath it all, an immense, terrifying power, now bent entirely to the task of keeping her alive. Varen felt her struggle, her terror, her pain. He felt the bond between them strain, becoming a conduit through which his very being flowed. The moonfire in her blood did not fight his shadow. It embraced it, guided it, showing it the path through her body to hunt down and devour the basilisk's magic. His darkness, tempered by her light, was no longer just a destructive force. It was a scalpel, an antidote. The gray pallor began to recede from her face. Color returned to her cheeks. Her fingers, once stone, twitched. She drew a ragged, shuddering breath, the first in an eternity, and the sound was the sweetest music Varen had ever heard. He felt the tide turn. The basilisk, seeing its magic failing, let out a frustrated hiss and charged, its claws scraping sparks from the stone floor. Varen didn't even turn. He kept one hand on Seren's face, anchoring her to life, and raised his other. A whip of pure, unadulterated shadow, blacker than the stone, more solid than the night, lashed out from his palm. It struck the charging beast not with an impact, but with a chilling silence. Where the shadow touched, there was only void. The basilisk's head and neck dissolved into nothingness, not even leaving dust behind. Its heavy body crashed to the floor, skidding to a halt just feet from them, a headless, grotesque monument to a power that should not exist. The tunnel fell silent. The only sound was Seren's harsh, gasping breaths as feeling returned to her limbs. Varen pulled his hand away, the connection snapping, leaving them both feeling hollowed out and exposed. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her chest, as if to make sure her heart was still her own. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of a monster, but the awe-filled terror of a mortal who had just stared into the heart of a god. "I felt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Inside me. Your darkness. It was everywhere." "I had no choice," he said, his own voice rough with exhaustion. The effort had drained him, leaving him feeling raw and frayed. It was the only way. She didn't accuse him, she simply nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The space between them now crackled with a new, dangerous energy. The barriers were gone. She had felt the truth of him, and he had anchored himself to her light. They were no longer two fugitives running together. They were two halves of a terrifying whole, and neither of them knew what that meant. He retrieved his sword and the satchel of scrolls, his movements stiff. "We have to keep moving." They walked on, the silence between them now deeper, more profound than before. They eventually found the exit Olien had described, a crumbling stone staircase that spiraled up into the roots of a great ironwood tree. They emerged into the cool, pre-dawn air, the sky a blanket of deep indigo pricked with the last fading stars. They were in a forest, miles beyond the city walls. In the distance, they could see the faint glow of Elendor, a gilded cage of light and fire they had just escaped. For the first time in a century, Varen was free of the city, but he felt more trapped than ever, bound by the prophecy, by Olien's sacrifice, and by the woman whose life was now irrevocably tied to his. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the side of a rocky hill, hidden by a thicket of thorns. As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Seren finally broke the silence. "The scrolls," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Olien died for them. We should see what he wanted us to know." Varen agreed. He built a small, smokeless fire, using a trick of friction and dry tinder, a survival skill from a life he'd almost forgotten. In the flickering light, Seren carefully unrolled the first of the scrolls. The parchment was ancient, the ink faded, but the script was Olien's own careful hand. It was a transcription of a much older text. "It speaks of a place," she murmured, her finger tracing the lines of script. "The hearth of the world, the heart of the mountain, a sanctuary hidden in the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, where the veil between the mortal plane and the elemental realm of shadow is thin. It says that it is the only place where the primal flame can be reforged." "Reforged?" Varen asked, leaning closer. "It says the sealing ritual performed by the Sunfire Lords didn't just bind your wings. It corrupted the nature of your fire, turning it inward, forcing it to consume itself, to consume you. The ritual at the heart of the mountain is the only thing that can break the seals and purify the flame, restoring its true balance." Her eyes met his, wide and filled with a fragile hope. "It's a cure, Varen, a way to fix what they did to you." He felt his heart seize. A cure. Freedom. The words were so foreign, so dangerous in their allure. To fly again, to feel the sun and wind not as an exile, but as a creature of the sky. It was a dream he had buried so deep he'd forgotten its shape. He took the scroll from her, his own eyes scanning the text. It described a perilous journey north, through treacherous lands patrolled by the Ironscale Order. But it was the final passage that made his blood turn to ice. It was a historical footnote, an addendum by Olien detailing the Sunfire Purge. "The final blow against the Shadow Clans was struck at the Battle of the Weeping Peaks," he read aloud. his voice a strained whisper. The sealing ritual, a masterwork of light weaving and blood magic, was devised and led by the youngest dragon lord of the era, a prodigy of fire and zealotry. His name is recorded here, a warning to all who would seek to undo his work. He was Lord Kalin, of the Sunfire clan. Seren gasped. Kalin? The same dragon lord who rules Elendor now? The one who is hunting us? Varen's hands clenched, the ancient parchment crinkling in his grip. It wasn't Kalin's ancestor. It wasn't his house. It was him. The same dragon, ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless. The very being who had personally ripped the sky from him, who had branded his flesh and cursed his soul, was the one hunting them now. This wasn't just a flight for survival. It was a collision course with his own personal devil. The name Kalin lay between them like a drawn blade. For Varen, it was not just a name. It was the sound of tearing wings, the smell of his own burning flesh, the searing agony of the seals being branded onto his back. It was the architect of his century-long damnation. The hope that had flickered to life in the scholar's library now curdled into something cold and hard in his gut. Vengeance. This changes nothing, he said, his voice flat and brittle. He crushed the scroll in his fist, the ancient parchment groaning in protest. The small campfire sputtered, its flames turning a sickly violet-tinged color as the shadow fire roiling inside him leached their warmth. The destination is the same. The path is the same. Now the monster at the end of it has a face I remember. Seren watched him, her expression a mixture of pity and fear. She saw the change in him, the subtle shift from hunted fugitive to avenging phantom. The lines of his face had sharpened, the darkness in his eyes deepening into an abyss. Varen, the scroll speaks of a cure, of balance, not revenge. Revenge is a kind of balance, he retorted, rising to his feet to pace the confines of the small cave. He felt caged, not by the stone walls, but by his own history. He made me this, a broken, wingless thing forced to hide in the filth of human cities. He will not be allowed to sit on a throne of light and forget the atrocities he built it on. And what happens if you face him like this? She challenged, her voice rising to meet his intensity. Consumed by hate? The scroll said your fire is corrupted, that it consumes you. Isn't that what you'd be letting it do? You'd be giving Kalin the victory he wanted all those years ago. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was right. To march north fueled by nothing but a century of festering hatred would be to let the curse win. He would arrive at Kalin's feet not as a challenger, but as a self-immolating ghost. He stopped pacing and looked at her. Truly looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mess, but her eyes were clear and steady. In them, he did not see a tool, a key to a prophecy. He saw the woman who had faced a basilisk's gaze, who had felt the full weight of his darkness and had not run, the one whose light soothed the serpent in his soul. With a ragged sigh, the tension drained from his shoulders. The campfire flames flickered back to their normal, warm orange. You are right, he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He had not admitted to being wrong in a very long time. But the road to the Dragon's Tooth Mountains is long, and Kalin's hunters are not the only danger. Their journey began in earnest. Varen led them north, keeping to the wild, untamed lands that lay between the pockets of human civilization. He moved with an animal grace, teaching Seren how to read the land, how to find clean water, how to move without leaving a trace. He was a creature of the shadows, and here, in the deep woods and silent hills, he was in his element. Seren, in turn, proved to be more than just a city thief. She was resilient, a quick learner with a quiet strength that impressed him. She never complained about the hunger, the cold, or the constant, gnawing fear of being followed. And in the quiet moments, around their hidden camps at night, she would unroll Olian's scrolls. She read to him of the old world, of the time before the Sunfire Purge, when shadow and light dragons were not enemies but counterparts, two halves of a cosmic whole. She spoke of their rituals, their cities, their shared magic. She was rebuilding the history Kalin had tried to burn, and with every word, she was rebuilding something inside Varen, too. The bond between them deepened with every shared meal, every narrow escape, every silent look across a crackling fire. He became acutely aware of her presence, the soft sound of her breathing as she slept, the way her moonfire mark seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. The memory of his darkness flooding her senses in the tunnel was a constant, unspoken presence. It had forged an intimacy between them that was more profound than any physical touch. He knew the shape of her courage, and she knew the texture of his pain. About a week into their journey, they were forced to cross the Argent River, a wide, fast-moving torrent that sliced through a deep gorge. The only way across was a narrow, swaying rope bridge, a relic of some forgotten trade route. As they reached the center of the bridge, the wind whipping through the gorge, Varen froze. His head snapped up, his nostrils flaring. He smelled it before he saw it. The faint, acrid scent of sun-forged steel and the clean ozone tang of a dragonlord's presence. "Get down," he hissed, pushing Seren flat against the rough wooden planks of the bridge. On the far cliff, figures emerged from the trees, men in polished steel armor, emblazoned with the symbol of a blazing sun. The Iron Scale Order. There were at least a dozen of them, led by a hulking commander with a scarred face and cold, merciless eyes. And behind them, watching from the edge of the cliff, was the source of the ozone smell. Not Lord Kalen himself, but one of his lieutenants. The dragon was in his human form, a tall, arrogant man with hair the color of molten gold and eyes that burned with contained fire. "There they are," the commander of Vorlog bellowed, pointing a gauntleted finger at them. "The Shadow Spawn and the little Moon Witch." The lieutenant smirked. "Lord Kalen wants them alive, Vorlog, if possible. Her mark is of particular interest to his studies." Arrows hissed through the air. Varen moved with blinding speed, his dark blade a blur as he deflected the shafts. But they were trapped. Midway across the bridge, with nowhere to go, they were perfect targets. "I'll cut the bridge," Varen said, his mind racing. "We'll have to risk the fall." "There's no time," Seren cried out. Another volley of arrows was already on its way. In that moment of desperation, Varen looked at her. Her eyes were wide with fear, but also with a fierce, defiant trust. He saw the answer. It was the same terrifying gamble as in the aqueduct, but this time it would be a choice. "Give me your hand," he commanded. She didn't hesitate. She reached out, and he clasped her hand in his. The circuit completed, the spark ignited. This time, he didn't just pour his power into her. He drew her light into himself. The world exploded in a silent symphony of shadow and silver. He felt her cool, calming essence flood him, not extinguishing his shadow fire, but giving it shape, focus, a clarity it had never possessed. The rage was still there, but it was no longer a wildfire. It was a tempered blade. The agony from the seals on his back vanished, replaced by a thrumming, resonant power. Through the bond, Seren saw the world through his eyes. She saw the trajectory of each arrow, the subtle shifts in the soldiers' stances, the arrogant sneer on the Dragonlord's face. She felt his power, raw and vast, and with her own mind, her own light, she helped him guide it. Varen raised his free hand. The air around them grew cold. The light of the midday sun seemed to dim as shadows coalesced, rising from the gorge below like ink in water. But they were not chaotic wisps. They were tendrils of solid darkness, moving with the grace of a conductor's baton, guided by the silent communication passing between him and Seren. The arrows never reached them. A wall of woven shadow rose up, and the shafts dissolved into dust as they touched it. The soldiers on the cliff stared in disbelief. "What sorcery is this?" Vorlog roared. "It is the abomination Lord Kalen warned us of," the dragon lieutenant said, his voice tight with a mixture of fascination and alarm. "The bond is real." Varen didn't give them another chance. He pulled on the power, Seren's light acting as a focusing lens. He swept his hand sideways, and a great sweeping scythe of darkness flew across the gorge. It didn't aim for the men. It struck the cliff face just beneath their feet. There was no explosion, only a silent, chilling unmaking. The rock dissolved into black sand, and the entire ledge where the soldiers stood crumbled, sending them tumbling down the cliffside in a shower of stone and panicked cries. The dragon lieutenant cursed, his body beginning to shimmer with golden light as he prepared to shift. But Varen was faster. A single, sharp tendril of shadow shot out, faster than an arrow, and wrapped around the dragon's ankle. It didn't crush or dissolve. It simply held, an anchor of pure void. The dragon's transformation stuttered and failed. the Shadowfire's primal magic disrupting his own. Varen pulled, yanking the powerful being off his feet. He and Seren ran, their hands still clasped, a living conduit of impossible power. They reached the far side of the bridge just as Varen's shadow anchor dissolved, releasing the lieutenant. They plunged into the forest, not looking back. They ran until their lungs burned and the sounds of pursuit had faded completely. When they finally collapsed at the base of an ancient, moss-covered tree, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving them shaking and breathless. He was still holding her hand. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. The power was gone, but the echo of it remained, a deep, humming resonance in his blood. "We did that," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Together." Before he could answer, a faint sound reached them from the direction they'd come, the voice of Commander Vorlog shouting orders. He had survived the fall. Varen pulled Seren deeper into the shadows of the forest, and they listened. "Find them," Vorlog was yelling to his remaining men. "The informant was right. The Shadowcrest dragon did not lie. The bond is active. Get the sun-forged arrows. He can't block those. Lord Kalen will have their heads if they reach the mountains." Varen and Seren exchanged a look of cold shock. Shadowcrest dragon? A rival clan. There was a traitor within the dragon hierarchy, feeding information to the human hunters. But it was the other words that chilled Varen to the bone. Sun-forged arrows, a weapon designed specifically for him. Their enemy wasn't just hunting them. They were prepared for them. They had a weapon he might not be able to stop. The words Shadowcrest dragon echoed in the silent forest, a poisoned whisper that twisted the very air they breathed. Varen's mind reeled. The Shadowcrest clan were traditionalists, rivals of the Sunfire Lords, who believed in a rigid separation of the dragon and human worlds. They saw Kalen's use of the Ironscale Order as a perversion of their kind. To think one of them was secretly allied with Vorlog, with Kalen's own hunters, was a betrayal so profound it defied logic. Unless the Shadowcrest clan feared the prophecy even more than Kalen did. They didn't want Kalen to win, but they certainly didn't want Varen, the living embodiment of a forgotten, primal power, to succeed either. This was no longer a simple hunt. It was a political conspiracy, a multi-front war fought in shadows and whispers, and he and Seren were the unwitting pawns at its center. "We're being herded," Varen said, his voice a low growl. "This isn't a chase, it's a trap. Someone is feeding Kalen our position, keeping his hunters just close enough to push us, to tire us out, to drive us toward a killing ground of their choosing." Seren clutched the satchel of scrolls, her knuckles white. "The mountains. Vorlog said Kalen would have their heads if we reach the mountains. They know where we're going. They know about the heart of the mountain." The realization was a crushing weight. Olien's secret, the last hope of a dying scholar, was already in the hands of their enemies. Their quest for a cure had become a race to an ambush. "Then we stop running," Varen decided, a cold, hard certainty settling in his eyes. He looked at the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Range, now visible on the distant horizon. "We start hiding. We will move only at night. We will become ghosts. Let them think they've lost us. We will make them spread out, make them careless. We will get to that mountain, Seren, but we will do it on our own terms." The days that followed were a grueling test of endurance and will. They traveled under the cloak of darkness, sleeping in hollow logs and hidden crevices during the day. Varen taught Seren the art of the silent hunt, how to trap small game, how to find edible roots. He was stripping away the last vestiges of his human disguise, reverting to the primal instincts that had been suppressed for a century. And Seren matched him step for step, her city-bred toughness hardening into a true survivor's grit. Their bond became their greatest weapon and their most intimate secret. They learned to speak through it without words. A gentle squeeze of the hand, a slight push of her light into his darkness was enough to signal danger, to point out a path, to offer comfort in the suffocating silence. He learned the different textures of her light, the bright, sharp flare of fear, the soft, steady glow of determination, the warm, gentle pulse of affection. He, in turn, learned to navigate the complex currents of his shadow fire, the cold, still depths of his sorrow, the roiling volcanic rage, and the deep, possessive warmth that surfaced only when he looked at her. One night, as a storm raged around the high peaks, they found shelter in a cave high on a mountainside, its entrance curtained by a waterfall. They were soaked, shivering, and exhausted. Varen built a fire deep within the cave, its light flickering off the damp stone walls. Seren sat huddled in her cloak, staring into the flames. "Do you ever wonder what it will be like?" she asked softly. "If the ritual works? To have your wings back? To fly?" Varen was sharpening his blade on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only other sound. He paused, his gaze distant. "I try not to," he said, his voice rough. "Hope is a luxury, the memory of the sky. It's a phantom limb. Sometimes, in my sleep, I feel the wind under my wings. I feel the plunge, the climb, the freedom. Then I wake up, and the weight of these seals, this flesh, feels 100 times heavier." He looked at the scars on his own hands, at the calluses and faint burns that marked a life of hiding. "I don't remember what it feels like to be whole." Seren moved closer, her shoulder brushing against his. The contact was a small, simple thing, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him that had nothing to do with their shared power. It was just her. "When you touched me in the aqueduct," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "when your darkness was inside me, I felt more than just your pain. I felt your true self, the dragon. It wasn't a monster, Varen. It was magnificent, ancient and powerful and so incredibly alive. Kalen didn't just take your wings. He tried to smother the sun." He turned to look at her, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. The firelight danced in her storm-gray eyes, turning them to molten silver. In that moment, he saw her not as the lunar scion, not as a key to his salvation, but as Seren, the woman who saw the magnificence in his curse, who called his lonely darkness a smothered sun. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking a stray, damp strand of hair behind her ear. His touch lingered on the soft skin of her temple, just beside her moonfire mark. The mark pulsed with a soft silvery light, bathing them both in its glow. "You are my sky now, Seren," he breathed, the confession torn from the deepest part of his soul. The world seemed to fall away. There were no hunters, no prophecies, no vengeful dragon lords. There was only the sound of the waterfall, the crackling of the fire, and the frantic, synchronized beating of their two hearts. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. His lips were firm and cool, a stark contrast to the fire that erupted between them. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of worlds, a desperate, hungry claiming. It was a century of loneliness, and a lifetime of being an outcast poured into a single breathtaking moment. Her light and his shadow surged, not as a weapon, but as a pure, unrestrained expression of their bond. He tasted the rain on her lips and the fierce, unyielding strength in her soul. She tasted the ancient sorrow in his, and the deep, desperate well of his need. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The cave felt charged, sacred. They had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The next few days were spent in the final, treacherous climb to the heart of the mountain. The air grew thin and cold. The landscape became a stark, brutal world of snow and black rock. They saw the hunters below, tiny figures spread out across the lower slopes, their search growing more frantic as they realized their prey had slipped the net. The location described in Olyan's scroll was not a temple or a ruin, but a specific geological formation, a caldera, the collapsed heart of a dead volcano. At its center, the scroll promised, was a nexus of power, a place where the world was thin. They reached the rim of the caldera at twilight. The sight below stole their breath. The vast circular crater was filled with a forest of colossal, crystalline structures that pulsed with a faint inner luminescence. At the very center of the caldera floor was a raised obsidian dais, perfectly smooth and reflective, like a pool of black, frozen water. This was the hearth of the world. A sense of profound reverence and dread washed over Varen. This was the place where his fate would be decided. He would either be healed or he would be destroyed. They made their way down the treacherous inner slope, the crystalline forest seeming to hum with a low, resonant energy as they passed. When they finally stepped onto the obsidian dais, the air grew still and heavy. The ground beneath their feet felt warm. Seren unrolled the final scroll, the one detailing the ritual itself. Her breath misted in the cold air as she read. It says, "It requires two things. The primal flame must be offered freely, And the catalyst, the lunar scion, must act as the anchor. It says you have to release your dragon form. Here, on this altar. Varen looked at the unholy scars on his back, visible as outlines through his tunic. I can't. The seals bind you to your human form, she said, her eyes wide with understanding. But they are powered by sunfire magic. This place, it's a nexus of shadow. The scroll says the ambient energy here should weaken them. But you will have to fight them. You have to be willing to break yourself open. She looked at him, her face pale but resolute. And I have to be here to catch you, to ground you. It says my light is the only thing that will keep your true form from being unmade by the raw power of this place. The price of his freedom was to make himself utterly vulnerable, to unleash the very thing he had been taught to fear and hate, and to trust her light, her strength, to hold him together. He took a deep breath, the icy air burning his lungs. All right, he stood in the center of the obsidian dais and pulled off his tunic. In the strange crystalline light, the branded seals on his back seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent heat, fighting against the ambient shadow energy of the caldera. He closed his eyes, turning his focus inward. He reached for the coiled serpent of his shadow fire, but this time he did not suppress it. He did not fight it. He surrendered to it. Seren, he said, his voice strained. Whatever happens, don't let go. She came to stand before him and placed both her palms flat against his chest. Her moonfire mark blazed to life, and a column of pure silver light enveloped them both. I'm here, she whispered. I won't let go. Varen roared, a sound that was not human. It was the roar of a caged god breaking its chains. He threw his head back and let the shadow fire surge. The seals on his back flared with incandescent sunfire magic, fighting back. The pain was beyond anything he had ever known, a feeling of being torn apart on a molecular level. His skin split open along the scar lines, not with blood, but with pure black energy. From his back, two vast mangled shapes of shadow and light began to unfurl. They were not wings of flesh and bone, but of raw, untamed magic. The battle between the sunfire seals and his primal flame was reaching its crescendo. The obsidian dais beneath him began to crack, unable to contain the forces being unleashed. Just as he felt his consciousness begin to fray, to dissolve into the warring energies, he felt Seren's light pour into him, cool and steady, a lifeline in the heart of the storm. She was his anchor, his center. With a final, soul-shattering scream, Varen broke the last of his bonds. High above, on the rim of the caldera, Lord Kalen stood, his golden hair whipping in the wind. He had felt the surge of power, the breaking of his ancient magic. He looked down at the maelstrom of silver light and black fire. Beside him, Commander Vorlog nervously hefted a crossbow loaded with a single gleaming bolt, an arrow forged in the heart of a sun, the only weapon in the world that could kill a shadow dragon. So, Kalen murmured, a slow, terrible smile spreading across his lips. The monster has finally come out to play. The world dissolved into a storm of agonizing power. Varen's human form was a memory, a vessel shattered by the raw force of his true nature. He was a tempest of shadow and pain, his consciousness stretched to a threadbare whisper. The sunfire seals, Kalen's century-old curse, fought with the ferocity of a dying star, tearing at his essence, trying to pull him apart before he could reform. He felt himself unmaking, dissolving into the chaotic energy he had just unleashed. This wasn't freedom, it was annihilation, but through the searing agony there was Seren. Her light was not a gentle stream. It was a dam holding back the ocean, a fortress wall against the hurricane. Pinned at the heart of the storm, she held on to him, her palms pressed against the epicenter of his transformation. She poured every ounce of her will, every flicker of her moonfire, into him. It was not a battle against his darkness, but a weaving. She became the loom upon which his shredded soul was being respun. She took the raw, chaotic threads of his shadow fire, and guided by an instinct older than memory, began to knit them together. She was not just an anchor, she was an architect. Through their bond, Varen felt her. He felt her fear, her exhaustion, the terrible strain of containing a power meant to level mountains. But beneath it all, he felt her unwavering belief. She was not afraid of the dragon. She was calling it home. That belief became his new center. He stopped fighting the pain and began to move with it, using her light as a guide. The shattered pieces of himself began to coalesce. The formless, raging tempest started to take shape. Vast, powerful limbs of solidified shadow, a body forged from the twilight between worlds. And the wings, oh the wings, they unfurled, not as appendages of flesh, but as great star-dusted sails of night itself, each membrane a captive piece of the void, peppered with the cold, distant light of forgotten constellations. The last of the sunfire seals shattered, exploding outward in a shower of golden sparks that hissed and died against the overwhelming darkness. The pain vanished, replaced by a feeling of sublime, terrifying wholeness. Varen, the shadow dragon, was reborn. He was immense, far larger than any sunfire dragon. His scales were not scales at all, but interlocking plates of obsidian that seemed to drink the light, shifting and flowing like liquid night. His eyes burned with the cold, intelligent light of violet stars. He lowered his massive head, the horns like polished jet curving around a noble, intelligent face, and looked at the small, fragile figure standing before him. Seren stood in the eye of the hurricane that was him, her hand still resting on his chest, her moonfire mark glowing with a soft, steady radiance. She was not afraid. She simply looked up at him, her storm-gray eyes filled with a love so profound it humbled the ancient power coursing through him. A low, resonant purr, like the shifting of tectonic plates, rumbled in his chest. It was a sound of gratitude, of recognition, of a bond reforged and made absolute. On the rim of the caldera, Vorlog trembled, his knuckles white on the stock of the sun-forged crossbow. The sheer, oppressive presence of the shadow dragon was a physical force, a wave of cold that seemed to leach the courage from his very bones. "My lord Kaelin," he stammered. "Now?" Kaelin did not answer. He was transfixed. He had expected a monster, a slavering beast of chaotic destruction. He had not expected this. He had not expected this majesty, this silent, perfect union of light and shadow. He saw the woman, the lunar scion, standing untouched, her hand resting on the beast as if it were a beloved pet. This was not a curse unleashed. This was a destiny fulfilled, and it was a destiny that would mean the end of his reign. His face, a mask of aristocratic beauty, twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. "Now, Vorlig," he hissed, "shoot the girl." The command was a stroke of cruel genius. Kill the anchor and the dragon would unravel. Vorlog obeyed, his training overriding his fear. He lifted the crossbow, the sun-forged arrow glowing with a fierce inner light. He took aim, not at the colossal dragon, but at the small, silver-haired woman at its feet. Varen sensed the shift in intent instantly. He saw the crossbow lift, saw the arrow's brilliant, hateful light. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. He could not move his massive body fast enough to shield her. He could not lash out with his power without engulfing her in the attack. He was a god and he was helpless. A roar of pure, desperate fury tore from his throat, a sound that cracked the very stones of the caldera. Seren heard the roar and saw the golden glint on the clifftop. She understood in an instant. There was no time to run, no time to hide. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in focus. She reached for the bond, for the vast ocean of shadow that was Varen. She didn't ask for his protection, she took it. A shield of pure, solid darkness, guided by her will, erupted from the ground before her. It was not a wall, it was a swirling vortex, a miniature black hole. The sun-forged arrow hissed through the air, a tiny golden meteor. It struck the vortex and vanished. The light, the magic, the very substance of the arrow was not blocked or deflected. It was consumed, unmade, and fed to the endless hunger of the void. Vorlog stared, his mouth agape. The ultimate weapon, gone, as if it had never been. Kaelin's aristocratic calm finally shattered. With a scream of incandescent rage, he abandoned his human guise. Golden fire exploded from him, and in a heartbeat, a magnificent, terrifying sunfire dragon took his place. Kaelin was larger than most of his kind. His scales the color of 1,000 sunsets, his wings vast membranes of captured sunlight. He launched himself from the cliff, a living comet of righteous fury, diving toward the caldera floor. "You are a blasphemy," Kaelin's voice boomed. not through the air, but directly into Varen's mind. A telepathic assault of pure, searing light. I cast you down once, abomination. I will tear you from this world and burn your very memory from the sky. Varen met the assault, his own mind a fortress of cold, quiet night. You did not cast me down, Kaelin, he replied, his telepathic voice the sound of shifting stars and turning ages. You merely delayed me. He turned his full attention to the diving Sunfire Lord, shielding Seren with his body. He unfurled his wings for the first time, catching the strange, thin air of the caldera. The feeling was ecstasy. It was instinct. It was memory and future combined. With a single powerful downbeat, he launched himself into the air. The two dragons met in the center of the caldera, a cataclysmic collision of absolute light and absolute dark. Kaelin breathed a torrent of golden flame, a fire hot enough to melt stone. Varen did not meet it with fire of his own. He met it with shadow. He opened his maw and exhaled a wave of pure void, an unnerving, silent wave of anti-energy that swallowed Kaelin's fire, snuffing it out as if it had never been. The Sunfire Lord roared in frustration and lunged, his claws like sharpened spears of sunstone aimed at Varen's throat. Varen was not a brawler. His fighting style was different. He flowed, he dissolved, he moved like smoke. He shifted his body into a semi-corporeal state, and Kaelin's claws passed through him, meeting only cold, empty air. Before Kaelin could recover, Varen solidified behind him, his shadow-wrought tail whipping around to slam into the Sunfire Dragon's side with the force of a landslide. Kaelin crashed into the crystalline forest, shattering the ancient structures into a million glittering shards. He rose, shaking his head, his golden eyes burning with disbelief and fury. This was not the chaotic, cursed creature he had defeated a century ago. This was something else entirely, something complete. He looked past Varen to the woman on the dais. She was the key. Her light was guiding the shadow, giving it form and purpose. Changing tactics, Kaelin ignored Varen and shot past him, diving for Seren. Vorlog and the remaining hunters, seeing their lord's intent, began scrambling down the inner slope of the caldera, their swords drawn. Varen felt a surge of cold primal fury that dwarfed anything he had ever felt before. The bond screamed with Seren's alarm. He teleported, not flying, but simply dissolving from one point and reappearing in another, a feat of shadow magic Kaelin could not possibly comprehend. He materialized directly in Kaelin's path, a mountain of nightfall appearing from nowhere. Kaelin, caught by surprise, could not stop his momentum. He slammed into Varen's chest. The impact was titanic, but this time Varen did not yield. He wrapped his powerful limbs around the Sunfire Dragon, his claws of solidified shadow digging into the golden scales. They tumbled from the sky, locked in a deadly embrace, and crashed onto the obsidian dais just feet from Seren. The dais cracked and splintered under their combined weight. Kaelin, pinned beneath Varen, struggled, blasting point-blank torrents of flame that splashed harmlessly against Varen's void-like hide. "It is over, Kaelin," Varen's voice echoed in his mind. "Your age of light is at an end. There will be balance now." "Never!" Kaelin roared, and with a final, desperate surge of power, he caused the sunstone gems embedded in his own armor-like scales to detonate. The explosion was a nova of pure, concentrated sunlight, a last, suicidal gambit to annihilate them both. The world went white. Seren cried out, throwing her arms up to shield her eyes, but the killing blow never came. When the light faded, she saw Varen, his wings wrapped tightly around her and himself, forming a perfect sealed dome of night. He had taken the full force of Kaelin's final attack. He slowly, painfully unfurled his wings. They were scorched, tattered, great holes burned through the membranes of shadow. Kaelin lay in the center of a blackened, glassy crater, his golden scales charred and broken, his light extinguished forever. Varen staggered, his massive form flickering, threatening to dissolve. The effort of the transformation, the fight, and shielding them from the explosion had taken its toll. His connection with Seren was the only thing holding him together. Just then, Vorlog and his hunters arrived, swarming the dais, their swords raised. They saw their dead lord, and their faces turned to masks of vengeful fury. "For the Sunfire!" Vorlog screamed, charging at the wounded shadow dragon. Varen tried to rise, to summon his power, but he was spent. He could only lower his head, shielding Seren with his own body one last time, and wait for the bite of sun-forged steel. The bite of sun-forged steel never came. As Vorlog and his hunters charged, their faces contorted with the righteous fury of the bereaved, Seren stepped out from under Varen's protective wing. She stood before his massive, wounded head, a small, defiant figure against a backdrop of living night. Her simple thief's tunic was torn and stained, her face smudged with soot, but she held herself with the bearing of a queen. "Enough," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a resonance that cut through the war cries and the whistling wind. It was the voice of the moonlight, calm and absolute. Vorlog laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Get out of the way, witch. Your beast is dying. You will follow him to the void." He raised his sword for a killing blow. Seren did not move. She did not raise a weapon or a shield of shadow. She simply closed her eyes and reached inward, not for the destructive power of the void, but for the truth of the bond itself. She gathered the feeling of Varen's centuries of pain, the cool balm of her own light, the perfect, breathtaking harmony of their union, and she released it. It was not a wave of force, but a wave of pure, undeniable feeling. It washed over the charging hunters, and they faltered, their steps slowing. They felt it. They felt the agony of the seals being branded onto Varen's flesh a century ago. They felt his loneliness in the squalid streets of Elendor. Then they felt the cool, redemptive touch of Seren's light, the dissolution of his pain, the birth of a balance so profound, so natural, that it made the harsh, singular dogma of the Sunfire Creed feel like a lie. Their minds, indoctrinated with the simple binary of light and shadow, good and evil, were suddenly flooded with the complexity of the twilight. They saw Kalen not as a god, but as a tyrant, a zealot who had mutilated truth itself to maintain his power. Men dropped their swords, the clang of steel echoing in the sudden silence. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads, weeping at the sudden, violent collapse of their entire worldview. Others simply stood, their faces blank with shock, staring at the shadow dragon and the moon-marked woman not as monsters, but as a revelation. Only Vorlog resisted. His hatred was a shield too thick for truth to penetrate. "Tricks! Witchcraft!" he roared, his face purpling with rage. He pushed through the wave of empathy, his own fanaticism burning away the revelation. He lunged, his sword aimed at Seren's heart. Varen, with the last of his strength, let out a weak, guttural hiss. A single thin tendril of shadow, no thicker than a whip, rose from the dais. It did not strike Vorlog. It wrapped around the hilt of his sword. The commander's fanatical hatred, his pure, unadulterated rage, was a fire of its own. The shadow fed on it. The sun-forged steel of his blade turned black, crumbled to dust, and the corruption raced up his arm, consuming not his flesh, but the hatred that defined him. Vorlog screamed, a high, thin sound of a man being hollowed out from the inside. He fell to the ground, not dead, but empty, his eyes wide and vacant. The fire of his fanaticism extinguished forever. The last of Varen's strength gave out. His magnificent dragon form flickered, dissolving like smoke in the wind. He collapsed, shrinking, reforming, until he was once again the man she had met in the Gallows Square. He lay naked and unconscious on the cold obsidian, his body no longer a ruin of scars. His skin was smooth, pale, and whole. The brands were gone. Kalen's curse was well and truly broken. Seren rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. The remaining hunters, their wills broken, slowly, silently, backed away and fled the caldera, leaving the dead tyrant, the empty zealot, and the two souls who had shattered their world. 6 months later, the heart of the mountain was no longer a place of stark, cold power. The crystalline forest, shattered in the battle, had regrown, but the new crystals glowed with a soft, ambient light that was neither silver nor black, but a gentle violet, the color of twilight. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of pine and mountain blossoms that had taken root in the caldera's rich soil. It had become a sanctuary, their home. Seren sat on the edge of the obsidian dais, which was now smooth and whole again, mended by the same quiet magic that had healed the rest of the caldera. She was stitching a new tunic for Varen from soft deer hide. She was no longer gaunt or haunted. Her hair, now long and cared for, shone like a river of moonlight. Her face held a serene confidence. She was the lunar scion, but she was also just Seren, and she was happy. The whisper of powerful wings on the air made her look up and smile. Varen descended from the sky, his landing a gentle thump that barely disturbed the air. He was in his dragon form, but he looked different now. His wings were fully healed, the membranes no longer pure void, but woven with threads of silver light, like a nebula. His obsidian scales held a faint pearlescent shimmer. He was the perfect physical manifestation of their bond. He nudged her gently with his massive head, the purr rumbling in his chest. She leaned into him, her hand stroking the smooth, warm scales. The Sunfire clan has sent another envoy. His voice echoed in her mind, a gentle rumble of thought and affection. They offer the throne of Elendor. They are lost without a leader and terrified the Shadowcrest clan will use the vacuum to seize power. Seren smiled. And what did you tell them? She sent back, her own thoughts a cool, clear stream in their shared consciousness. The same thing I told them the last time, he replied. The world does not need another throne. It needs to learn to find its own balance. He lowered his wing, offering it as a ramp. Seren put aside her sewing, climbed onto his broad, strong back, and settled into the familiar hollow between his shoulders. With a powerful thrust, they launched into the sky, leaving their sanctuary behind to soar over the world they had changed. Elendor was in turmoil. It was true. The dragon clans were locked in a tense political standoff. The humans, their faith in the dragon lords shattered, were beginning to forge their own paths, their own kingdoms. The world was messy, chaotic, and uncertain, but it was also free, for the first time in centuries, from the tyranny of absolute light. It was a world where shadows were allowed to exist, where a balance could finally be struck. Varen and Seren did not rule it. They simply watched over it. Sometimes a frightened village would leave an offering at the base of the mountain, telling tales of a great twilight dragon and his silver-eyed rider who had driven off fell beasts or guided lost travelers. They had become a myth, a legend whispered on the wind. As the sun began to set, painting the clouds in fiery shades of orange and deep purple, Varen flew higher. Below them, the world was a tapestry of light and growing darkness. Seren leaned forward, her arms wrapped around his neck, her cheek pressed against his scales. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart, a rhythm that was now as familiar to her as her own. They were not light. They were not shadow. They were the quiet strength of the mountain, the endless patience of the stars. They were the whisper of hope in the dark and the promise of rest after the long, bright day. They were a love older than time, a bond forged in a scholar's secret and tempered in a dragon's fire. They were the twilight and the dawn and everything in between. And for the first time in a world they had helped to heal, they were finally, completely home.